So this unit is on the integumentary and the accessory organs um, that come along with it. I mean, you may already know that the integumentary system consists of the skin and all of tissues and other, again, accessory organs that help to support it. So we'll start first talking about basically the skin itself and the tissues that help to comprise the skin. And we've talked about before when we were talking about, um, we know it's made up of um, stratified squamous epithelial. That's going to be one of the tissues that help to make up the skin. But when we say skin itself, that is an organ. It is the largest organ that we have in the body. Another word that we use to describe the skin is cutaneous, and cutaneous simply means skin. So you'll hear a word later on that um, that uses the word cutaneous, and just remember that the word cutaneous means skin. And so again, this integumentary system is the skin and all those accessory organs that come with it, which are the nails, the glands, we say sensory receptors. We're talking about nerves, receptors within the skin so that we can touch or feel the sense of touch and pain and temperature and the like. Um, some of the tissues, for instance, like I said, we have some stratified squamous epithelial that helps to make up part of the skin, but there are a lot of other connective tissues that help to make up the two layers of skin, and those two layers are the epidermis and dermis. And the epidermis is going to be that top layer, and the dermis will be the second layer, or the one that's underneath the dermis. Anytime you see the prefix epi, that kind of means outside or top layer, and you'll see epi a lot from this point on in A&P as a prefix. So, going into what we consider skin. Again, the skin itself is just the epidermis and the dermis. And so the epidermis, like we mentioned before, stratified squamous epithelial, which means that we have multiple layers of flat cells. And that's going to be this part right here that's at the top. That's the stratified squamous epithelial. Okay. We also have our dermis, which is this huge portion here. It's going to be a lot thicker. It's going to also contain a lot of connective tissue. And those connective tissues, if you all remember from last time, we talked about collagen fibers and elastic fibers. So collagen fibers are those that are very strong, somewhat bendable, but more strong than bendable. Then we have the elastic fibers that are more bendable than they are strong. So it has a little bit of both in them. And the type of connective tissue that it has, or one of the ones, is the dense, irregular connective tissue. And we also have underneath the dermis the subcutaneous layer. Now, remember we said that cutaneous means skin, sub means below, so the subcutaneous layer is the layer that's below the skin. And so that's this layer right here. We're going to have a lot of areolar connective tissue and also a lot of adipose tissue. Remember, that's the fat, and so that's why we have adipose tissue here in the subcutaneous layer at the bottom. We also have blood vessels in the subcutaneous layer that help to supply nutrients for that layer. And we're going to go into a little bit more detail about the other two as well. So this is the basic structure of the skin, just a digital image of it. This looks very similar to what you will see in the models that we have, where you'll have this top layer, this the epidermis, second layer is the dermis, and the subcutaneous layer. And the subcutaneous layer, in case you see this word again, is sometimes called the hypodermis. Subcutaneous layer is also called hypodermis. Hypo means below, below the dermis. And as you can see within the dermis, we have tons of connective tissue. We have nerve endings, we have blood vessels, we have hair follicles, we have glands, and we'll get to all of that later in this video. So now we're going to first start talking about the epidermis. This is that upper layer. If you all remember, we talked about how epithelial tissue is avascular. And so it's made up of this stratified squamous epithelium, and it does not have a blood supply of its own, so it has to get nourishment from somewhere else. And so it gets its nourishment from the dermis. And so the dermis and all the blood vessels that are within it supplies those cells with the nutrients that they need. And so what happens, if we talked about again, it's made up of stratified squamous epithelial, and sometimes when it's stratified squamous epithelial, those that are towards the bottom aren't always like super flat. Sometimes they're more cube shaped, and then with stratified squamous epithelial, as they move upward, they start to flatten and flatten out. Okay? They start to flatten out more and more as they move upward. And so one of the concepts that you need to know is that these cells, they're going to, as they grow and as you make more cells towards the bottom, these are our newer cells. They're going to move upward, they flatten, and they die. They're also going to become keratinized, which means that they become a bit harder. Now, when we think about the skin on the surface of our bodies, we know it's not hard, but if we were to compare it to those that are on the underside or at the bottom, they are a bit tougher, and they are also a little bit more waterproof than those that are underneath. And so that's what keratin is that helps with this keratination process. It's this protein that helps to make it tougher. It helps to make it more waterproof as well. And so, again, it's pushed upward, it's outward, and they flatten and they die. And they migrate to the very top layer, because there are several layers of stratified squamous epithelium. That very top layer is what we call the stratum corneum. And so we have 5 layers of the epidermis, and you will need to know these in order. And I suggest coming up with a mnemonic of your own, or maybe using the mnemonic that I'm about to share with you. So you will need to know, again, this is the outermost here, and this is the deepest layer here. So going from outermost to innermost, the mnemonic that I use to help me remember them from the outside in is: can Lucy give some blood? So corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, and stratum basal. I've also seen the mnemonic that says, come, let's get sunburned. Whatever works for you is perfectly fine. If you don't need a mnemonic, that's perfectly fine as well, but that is just what I've always used. Even as a teacher, I use a mnemonic to help me remember them in order. And so the stratum corneum, which is the outermost layer, it is going to be where those dead skin cells are located, because remember again, they are pushed upward, outward, they flatten, and they die. They're also becoming keratinized, which means they're waterproof. And so those skin cells that we were to scratch our skin, what's on the underside of our nails at that point is stratum corneum. And then we have the stratum lucidum, which is the layer that's only going to be found in the palms of our hand and the soles of our feet. So we don't find them like on the arm or the leg. We don't find stratum lucidum there. It's going to be that very thick layer that we see in very thickened part of the skin, like, again, the soles of our feet. And then we have our stratum granulosum, which is the next layer, stratum spinosum. These are just layers that the cells push up through. And then we have the very last layer, stratum basal. Stratum basal is going to be the mitotic layer. Now, hopefully the word mitotic sounds familiar, like mitosis. And so this is going to be where cell division is happening. So this is where we have new cells. Because remember, cells are produced, they're pushed upward, they flatten, and they die. And so in the stratum basal is where we have those new cells, and they're pushed upward, they flatten, they die. And so the skin, when we're talking about the functions of the skin, because it's keratinized, because it's so thick, it has so many layers, it has a couple different functions. First, to retard against water loss, to slow water loss, so that we don't lose a lot of water. We know that we are made up of a lot of water and we don't want to lose it. So the skin is there to do that. It's also there to keep anything that's supposed to be out from keeping it from getting inside the body. It's like the body's first line of defense. Also, within the skin, we have very specialized cells called melanocytes. Again, anytime you see the word cytes, that's cells. So melanocytes are cells within the epidermis, specifically within the stratum basal, and they're going to produce melanin. So melanocytes are cells in the stratum basal that produce melanin. And melanin is what's going to give us our color, our skin color. And everyone has melanocytes. No matter what your skin color is, everyone has melanocytes. It's just that some people's melanocytes produce more pigment than others. The more pigment, the darker your skin tone is. What's also interesting for melanocytes is that they're going to be responsible for absorbing UV radiation. So another function of the skin is to produce vitamin D. And we produce vitamin D by going into the sun, getting UV, and that UV helps us to convert into UV helps us convert into vitamin D. Not us convert to vitamin D, but to convert chemicals into vitamin D. And so our melanocytes are also going to be responsible for absorbing that UV radiation. But they also realize when we are absorbing too much UV radiation, because once they start to absorb UV radiation, they will start to produce melanin. This is why we tan when we go out into the sun for prolonged periods of time. This is why we become darker. It's our skin's way of trying to protect us from the UV radiation. So melanin, although it is a pigment that's in our skin, but actually is there for protection, so that we can block the UV radiation that we have exposed ourselves to. And so that is kind of a clue that you shouldn't kind of stay out in the sun and bathe in the sun, because UV radiation could cause damage, and the skin is doing this thing of tanning to protect us from the UV radiation that we're exposing ourselves to. And of course, UV radiation can cause a lot of damage, DNA damage, mutations, and of course, skin cancer. So when we talk about skin color in a little bit more detail, we have a couple different things that's going to be responsible for affecting skin color. Of course, very first one, our genes, heredity, right? So whatever your parents look like, that's going to influence the way that you look, okay? Their skin tone affects your skin tone. Again, we all have melanocytes, but the genetics is what controls the amount of melanin that is produced. In addition, environmental factors. Environment, that's that UV radiation, that sunlight. And so again, like we said, if we go into the sunlight, we're exposed to too much sun or UV radiation, even from sun lamps, i.e. Tanning beds, that's going to cause us to produce more melanin, which is trying to protect us from this UV, and we become tan. And then we have physiological factors. That's like physiology. We talked about anatomy and physiology, so something that's functioning inside the body. So if we are too hot or too cold, that could cause us to change colors. For instance, if we become too hot, you get this red color. You become red because of vasodilation. Vaso just means blood vessel. Dilation means that they're getting wider or opening up or bigger. And so because they are becoming bigger, more blood is being able to get to that area. And again, those blood vessels are dilating and we turn red. But on the opposite side, when we're cold, you turn this kind of pale, maybe even bluish color. I know my fingertips get very, very blue when I get too cold. That's because the blood vessels in those areas vasoconstrict. That means that they're cutting off the blood supply in that area so that we won't lose body heat, because blood carries heat. And so when we are able to lose heat, then we can stay warmer in those specific or those colder temperatures. And of course, some of the things that we eat, like keratin, which is a protein that is going to, or a pigment that's found in certain foods like carrots, and even jaundice. Jaundice will give us this yellowing color, and that is a sign that there may be some type of issue with the liver. You'll have this yellow tint to the skin and this yellow color of your eyes. And this is what I was referring to about tanning and skin cancer. There is, of course, a correlation. Again, we all have melanocytes, and we have several things that are going to affect the way or the amount of melanin that's produced. Those environmental factors are those things that we expose ourselves to on the outside. The UV radiation is going to cause that protective response that we have against skin cancer is going to kind of overwhelm it, and it's going to cause those cells to start to multiply a little bit more than they should and cause cancers or tumors. We have basal cell carcinoma and squamous cell carcinoma. They're common, but those two, if they are found early on, won't be as fatal. However, we have melanomas, and melanomas are going to be the least common of the three that you usually hear of, but this one is the most fatal. And melanoma is named because it is the cancer of the melanocytes. And usually these are going to be like a spot or a mole that has turned this very dark, brownish color, or it may be something that has just started to develop on your skin that you've never had before. That's why it's so important to know your skin, what's on it, and be able to detect changes if there are any. So the next part of the skin under the dermis is under the epidermis is the dermis. This is the extremely thick part of the skin here, and it has so many different structures in it, but one of the structures are dermal papillae. And that's these little lumps and bumps right in here. Dermal papillae are the projections of the top of the papilla, or top of the dermis, and they're also going to be responsible for producing fingerprints. So those fingerprints are a result of the dermis pushing upward through the epidermis and creating the uniqueness of our fingerprints. Um, in addition, inside of our dermis, we have tons of blood vessels. That is what gives nutrients to, of course, the dermis, but also the epidermis because it doesn't have its own blood supply. We also have glands. We have sweat glands. We have oil glands. We have hair follicles we'll talk about. Um, we also have nerve fibers, and we'll talk about the two types of sensory receptors in a few. Another thing I like to kind of point out, one way to know that you have reached the dermis of your skin if you have some type of cut or scratch or injury is that you have bleeding. Because remember, the epidermis does not have any blood vessels itself. So if there's blood, then that lets you know that you have reached the dermis. This also lets you know that when a person gets a tattoo, that ink has to be being deposited in the dermis because number one, they have bleeding, and number two, a tattoo is permanent. And so if y'all recall with the epidermis is pushed outward, and it dies and it actually kind of sloughs off. So if it's constantly being pushed outward and being sloughed off, if the ink from a tattoo was only put in the epidermis, it wouldn't be permanent. It will constantly just kind of come off, right? Also, within our dermis, we have sensory receptors, we have Pacinian corpuscles. Those are the ones we use for deep pressure. That's these here that are quite deep. We have Meissner's corpuscles that for a light touch, and they are the ones that are going to be closer to the surface of the epidermis, which are here. A tactile or Meissner corpuscles. You find those in places like the lips that are hairless and again respond to very sensitive touch. Also, the dermis, we can sometimes separate it into two layers, the papillary layer, dermal papillae, so that's going to be the superficial, the outer layer. We're going to have a lot of areolar connective tissue there. And of course, like I said, the dermal papillae is there. So that's this top area. And then we have the reticular layer that's going to be that second part of the dermis. We have a lot of dense, irregular connective tissue. You remember we talked about dense is very tightly compact, but it's not as organized as that the dense, irregular connective tissue. So we're going to talk for a few slides about accessory structures of the skin, and that's going to include the hair follicles, the nails, the glands, and they're all made from epithelial cells. Okay, so the very first one are our nails. A nail, again, is part of the integumentary system because it's made of epithelial cells. We have a couple structures of a nail that we'll talk about. We have our nail plate, which is just this top part. This is the part that we kind of paint when we want to. The nail bed is underneath it, so that's what you really don't see, or if your fingernail is ever lifted up, which I'm sure is kind of painful, that's when you'll see your nail bed. And then we have a very special structure called the lanula. The lanula is going to be what is kind of synonymous to the stratum basal of the epidermis. It's going to be where the most active cells that are growing, developing cells that are being produced, that's where they're going to be located. And just like the epidermis, where those cells are being pushed upward, they flatten, they die, and they kind of slough off, same thing happens here. These are our fresh new cells. They're pushed upward, outward, and they die. And then guess what do? Kind of cut them off. And some of y'all may actually could see the lunula on your fingertips. You may be able to see it on one finger, two fingers, maybe on all. I know for myself, I can only see my lunula on two of my fingers. Those are my thumbs. Doesn't mean that it's not present on my other hands or my other fingers. It just means that they are, my cuticle is probably covering it. And then we have our hair follicle. With our hair follicle, the hair follicle is the tube that holds the hair root. And at the base of the hair root is also synonymous to the lunula and the stratum basal. This is going to be that region of cell division. So this is going to be where those active cells are dividing. And guess what they're going to do? Just like the lunula, just like the stratum basal. They're pushed upward, outward, and they die. So the hair here, which was what we call the hair shaft, the hair on your head, the hair on your arms and legs, that hair is dead. So the hair on your head are dead cells. Now the hair within the root that's inside of that follicle at the base, those are alive. And they even have their own little blood supply to give it nutrients so that it can grow. Okay, but again, it's still made up of those epithelial cells just like everything else. We also have melanin that helps to produce the skin color, not skin color, well, it helps to produce skin color, but in this case, it helps to produce hair color. So varying amounts of melanin or types of melanin is going to change the type of hair color that we have, whether it's dark brown, black, blonde, red. Also attached to this tube, this hair follicle, is a muscle. And this is called the erector pili muscle. So what happens when we're cold, just like our muscles and on our skeleton, they're going to shiver, this smooth muscle is actually going to contract. And since it's attached to a hair follicle, when it contracts, it's going to cause that hair shaft to stand up, and we see what we call goosebumps. So that's what's going to cause goosebumps when we do become cold on our arms or in our body. Next, we have our sebaceous glands. Our sebaceous glands, if you all remember, we talked about merocrine, apocrine, and holocrine glands, which means that holocrine glands are going to secrete the entire cell with the secretion. And so a sebaceous gland is aka your oil glands, but we typically call it sebum. And so it's not really oil, but sebum, because you also have oil, but it's a lot of other just kind of debris and waste that's secreted there as well. And again, we have to have this, and it's associated right next to a hair follicle. I'm going to go back to this picture here. These are the sebaceous glands. And so they literally secrete sebum right to that hair follicle so that it can moisturize and soften that hair. Now, there can be issues if you have inflammation of the sebaceous gland, and that will be called acne. If you have too much sebum or inflammation of sebum or inflammation of the sebaceous gland, that's going to cause acne. We also have sweat glands, and sweat glands sometimes are called sudoriferous gland. I may use those two terms interchangeably, just know what they mean. And we have two types. We have our eccrine or apocrine glands, and they are all associated with different parts of the skin. An apocrine gland is going to be associated with a hair follicle. And our merocrine gland is going to just kind of terminate near a pore in the skin. So we're going to first talk with the eccrine or merocrine gland. Usually I'll say eccrine. This is the one that's going to respond to elevated body temperature, us getting warmer. So you'll have these on your forehead, your arm, your back, your chest. They will be activated whenever we get too hot. But then we have apocrine glands. Apocrine glands are a bit different. I'm sure you all have had a time where you may have had a presentation in class and the classroom is cold, so you're not hot. The classroom is cold, has the air on, but you know that you have this presentation and you start to sweat under your arms in your axillary region, your armpit. Has nothing to do with body temperature, has all to do with your emotions, anxiety, stress. Also, they can respond to sexual arousal, and so we have apocrine glands in the groin area as well. We have two what we call modified sweat glands, ceruminous glands, which secrete earwax. So it's actually a sweat gland, it's just a modified sweat gland. And mammary glands that secrete milk. And again, it is a sweat gland, just a modified sweat gland. So we've kind of mentioned a little bit of the skin's functions here and there, but some of the main ones that we have mentioned already for protection, our first line of defense is there to retard water loss. We have tons of sensory receptors like the Pacinian, Meissner's corpuscles. Secrete some waste like within our sebum, vitamin D whenever we're exposed to UV radiation, and helps us to regulate body temperature. If we're too hot, we have this red color because those blood vessels dilate. If we're too cold, they will constrict and we turn a more pale or bluish or cyan color. So, mentioned this a few times already, but if we are too hot or if we're too cold, of course, it's not just the skin that's working. It has to be something that's actually sensing that. So we have sensory receptors that are sensitive to temperature on the skin. But the skin just can't make the decision on its own to dilate blood vessels or constrict blood vessels. It has to be controlled by a set point in the hypothalamus. And this is what regulates that homeostatic mechanism. So the hypothalamus decides, oh, we're too hot or we're too cold, so that we can stay at 98.6 degrees. And depending on how hot or cold we are, it will adjust accordingly. And so there are a couple ways that we can release heat, or that heat is released. And 4 methods. I've talked about vasodilation and vasoconstriction. But the first way is radiation. For instance, if you go into a classroom, the classroom is extremely cold, but there are 30 students and all of you all have just been outside playing basketball or playing some sport, and you all come inside of the classroom. In about 5 minutes or so, that classroom won't be as cold as it was before you entered. And that is because your body is releasing heat into the surroundings. Even now, you could put your hand over someone's arm, probably even your own, and you will feel heat coming from it, because we're constantly releasing heat from our bodies, especially if someone is extremely hot. And you see this a lot in like football when it's very cold outside and you see the steam coming off of those football players. It's because they're trying to release heat from into their surroundings. And then we have conduction. Conduction, example of that would be if you sat into a chair. No one has sat in that chair all day. You sit in the chair initially is kind of cool because no one has been in it. So the heat will escape from your body into that chair. And that is why we've all experienced it. if you sit in a chair and you say, "Oh my gosh, someone's been sitting in this chair and got this chair very, very warm," that's because the body heat from that person has escaped their bodies and got into a cooler object. And then convection is just the currents of air circulating through air itself, or heat circulating in the air itself. And the very last one is evaporation, where the body, when we do get overheated, those sweat glands are activated. When those sweat glands are activated, we have now water on the surface of our skin. When that water evaporates, it causes a cooling effect, and heat is then carried away. And this is that one of the diagrams that we see a lot when we talk about homeostasis. Again, if it's too hot, and this is the same exact example that I've been using. If we're too hot, we have that stimulus of us being too hot. The control center, the hypothalamus, realizes, oh, we're too hot. What are we going to do? Those blood vessels are going to dilate, and also sweat glands are going to be activated, and that's going to cool us back down. So that's the negative feedback mechanism, because it's going in the opposite direction. If we're too cold, we know that we're going below the set point. Hypothalamus realizes something is wrong. Skeletal muscles will be activated. They'll start to contract. Also, dermal blood vessels will be constricted. We'll also have sweat glands that are going to be inactivated, and we'll be back to our set point so that we can regulate homeostasis. And when we do have issues with regulating temperature, then we could possibly send our body into hyperthermia or hypothermia. Hyper means too much, high. So thermia is in reference to temperature. So if we get too hot, that's going to minimize the effect of radiation. So radiation is the heat is not going to be able to leave the body too much as well as it needs to, because it's the day or outside may be extremely hot anyway, where it cannot even evaporate the sweat because it's so hot or so humid. And so a person may get, again, very weak, dizzy, nauseous. We've probably been somewhat close to hypothermia at some point in our lives. Don't want to get there, but you may have experienced it. And then we have hypothermia. Hypo means low. And so when we get too cold or exposed to too much coldness, of course we will shiver, but that could also we could lose consciousness. Our organs could start to shut down. We could be very confused. Could definitely cause issues. So the next section is going to be on wounds and burns. Whenever we have the skin and it's damaged, remember we said the skin is the body's first line of defense. And so whenever the skin is damaged, it has to do something that's going to help protect the body. And so the first thing that happens is that site is going to have some form of inflammation. When we say inflammation, we're talking about it's red, it's swollen, can be very painful. And for us, it doesn't really feel good, but all of that is in response to the body trying to fight off anything that could possibly get in. Those blood vessels start to dilate and it becomes red because we're allowing more blood to get in that area. More blood is in that area, which means that we have more white blood cells, more platelets that can clot blood, white blood cells that can fight off any pathogens that are in that area. So uncomfortable for us, but is very critical to the healing process. And so whenever we have a cut or wound, if it's very shallow, which means that it's not deep or superficial, it's very superficial, epidermis can heal, no problem. There won't be any scars, no issues. But if there's a deep cut and we begin to bleed, then we'll have blood that's going to be released, of course. But eventually, will start to clot. Okay? And that clot is going to consist of fibrin. And if you remember, those are fibers, type of fiber, connective tissues. And also blood cells and platelets. Blood cells so that we can have nutrients that get there, platelets so that the clotting can continue. Eventually that clot is going to dry and we'll have a scab. We've all experienced this part so far. But then we want to start this healing process. And so the epithelial cells will continue to reproduce, make more, so that we can fill in the gaps. But it also has to make sure that even the stuff that's underneath has to be kind of pieced together. And so those fibroblasts kind of are going to go in and kind of weave things together underneath because the wound is so deep. And then it will continue to grow, start to form, piece it together. Anything that's bad would have been phagocytized, which means they're going to engulf solid particles. Those will be those phagocytic macrophages. Eventually, the scab is going to fall off. All right, scab's not going to be there forever. If it's deep enough, or if it's too many fibers that form, then that's going to cause a scar. So most of this, I'm sure you could have told me this already if I asked you what happens when we have a deep cut. You may have left off the part about the fibroblasts and things kind of filling in, but you all know that blood is released, you have a scab that's formed, eventually the scab will fall off, a scar is formed, right? So the only part that you probably need to kind of add to your memory bank is the part about fibroblasts. This is just a picture showing exactly that, where you have the blood that's escaping, blood clots form, those macrophages, they're going to phagocytize anything that does not need to be there. Those fibroblasts kind of piece things together. We still have our blood clot and our scab that's going to form. Eventually this will slough off and a scar may be left behind. So, one of the last things we're going to talk about will be burns. And with burns, we have 3 different types. They can be either superficial, deep, or all the way through. So first, second, or third degree burn. We've all probably had some type of first degree burn where it's only going to burn through the epidermis. We may have had this with a sunburn, or maybe if you've touched the stove for too long, or maybe even touched the iron or flat iron that has fallen over your forehead and sat there for a little too long. That could cause a first degree burn. No issues. Within a week, it's going to be healed. Second degree burn is going to go past the epidermis and some of the dermis. Usually, you're going to have a bit of a blister that's formed. Usually, not always, but it just depends on how deep it is. Usually, the skin will regenerate with no problem. Not going to have any type of scarring. It's going to take a little bit longer for this to heal than the superficial first degree burn, but that's to be expected. Now a third degree burn. That's all the epidermis, all of the dermis, accessory structures like hair follicles. It may even, depending on how bad the burn is, it may even go past the subcutaneous layer, maybe even the underlying fat tissue or muscle tissue. This will often require a skin graft. Now, a skin graft is where people will have to get skin that's taken from one area of the body and put it on the burn area, and that's called an autograft. But we also have grafting that has taken, so we've advanced so much in skin grafting where they're now even using fish, specifically tilapia skin, to help with burns or skin grafting. So, doctors use what we call the rule of nines. When a patient goes into the doctor's office, we have divided, or they have divided the body into nines. Each leg is 9. The top part of the chest is 9. The bottom part is 9. Even the top part of the back is 9. The bottom part is 9. Each arm is 4.5, total of 9. And so this easily, or can help the doctor say, this person has 20% of the body is burned, or 5% of the body is burned, or 5% has third-degree burn and 20% has second-degree burn. And they can determine on that scale whether or not the person is in critical condition and what type of treatment they may have. And also to estimate types of fluids that need to be replaced so that the person won't dehydrate or have some type of infection. So, in the end, speaking of that, infection and dehydration, those are the two ways that people may experience some type of life-threatening situation when we're talking about the skin. Because remember, the skin is there to retard water loss, to protect us from water loss, and to keep out pathogens. And so if the skin is no longer there, now pathogens can get in and water can now escape. And so those are the two reasons why people may die from a burn. It's not from the burn itself. It's not from organs being damaged, because we can replace organs, but it's specifically because of the skin, or the skin not being there, and dehydration taking place, as well as infection taking place. And the very last thing, what we'll see at the end of each unit, when we're talking about our systems, our lifespan changes, and you will notice that it's somewhat depressing, because it kind of shows that as we age, everything kind of goes down. Everything stops doing what it should be. For instance, the dermis, the skin becomes thinner. Of course, we become wrinkled. We don't have as much fat in the subcutaneous layer. One good thing is we don't secrete as much oil, which means that we may not have as much acne as we get older. Our hair is going to gray because the melanin production is going to slow a bit more. We won't be able to produce vitamin D as much. That's why we have to make sure that we regulate our diets. It becomes very, things that our skin used to do just kind of slows down a lot. Okay, so that's the end of this chapter.